Hi, my name is Trevor Bagnall. Today I'm going to be doing some testing on the Ifootage Shark Skider Mini Complete Bundle. Now there's a lot of videos out on YouTube that are doing reviews on this, but one of the biggest questions that's still left in the minds of a lot of people thinking about buying this is it good enough in terms of its stability? A lot of videos were showing a lot of stuttery and jittery footage using this slider. Now, I'm going to test this doing a couple of things. One, I'm going to make sure that it's mounted on a very hard surface, level, and no possibility for vibrations from tripods or anything, any degrees of freedom that are not necessary. So this is going to get put on a hard surface table, big heavy table, so that the table doesn't move, and set up and do some slides back and forth. I'm also going to do the test using a variety of lenses. So I'm going to start off with light lenses, such as the Olympus 17mm f1.8, very light lens. Then I'm going to move up to the Leica 12 to 60 f2.8 to 4. That's a little bit heavier of a lens, but still a fairly light lens. And then lastly, we're going to shoot a few sequences using the Sigma 18 to 35. Now that's mounted on a Metabones because of course this is all micro four thirds mount with the GH5 doing all the filming. We'll do a variety of shots both with in-body image stabilization turned on and with it off so that we can do a comparison and try and rule out, again, as I said, any other external factors that could be causing any amount of jitter or judder in the operation of the device. Let's get into it. Full disclosure, this is not a sponsored video. I purchased a slider entirely with my own money. The L plate was a Christmas gift from my mother, so the opinion in this video is entirely my own. Okay, maybe mine and my mother's. So let's talk about the setup. All video shots on the slider are taken with the Panasonic GH5, shot in 4K, 30 frames per second, 8-bit, 100 megabit per second codec written to the internal SD card. The table upon which the slider weighs about 400 pounds with a 2-inch thick marble slab top. The table itself is sitting on a ceramic and concrete slab floor, thus eliminating any shake potential from the table or the floor itself. The slab on top of the table is also extremely flat. The slider was leveled on the 4 rubber leveling feet and checked with a spirit level and checked for wobble. The same slide pattern was programmed and used for each setup. The camera and lens used for each setup were balanced on a 15mm rod to determine center of gravity point on the Manfrotto style base plate, then the center of gravity point aligned to the center mark on the pan tilt head or X2 mini plate as applicable to get the best center of gravity. The slider carriage and pan tilt head were power cycled and allowed to recalibrate each time a new lens setup was used. 2 lengths of track, standard for the Slider Mini Complete Bundle, were used. The pre-programmed track pattern was to slide the entire distance of the track while panning from left to right, same direction as the travel of the slider, and while the head tilted upwards. So first up, I did the test, of course, with the Olympus 17mm. Now, I only did one series of tests with the 17mm, and that was with in-body image stabilization turned on and the autofocus turned on. And then in each case, for all the runs that I did with all the different lenses, I did a 1-minute slide. Then, of course, it would back pass at full speed between those slides. Then I would do a 30-second slide, followed by a 15-second slide. And then the fastest slide that we could do is, of course, 13 seconds for full traverse the length of the 2-track on the slider itself. So there was a little bit of a jiggle at the end of that run there. That was me playing around with the camera. And on that full speed back pass, so that's less than 13 seconds to make that back pass. It's pretty stable throughout most of that. Of course, it's not going to follow the same pattern on the back pass. It resets the pan and tilt very quickly to the starting position, and it takes a lot longer for the slider to slide the whole distance back to its starting point. Next up, we mounted the Leica 12-60 on top of the X2 Mini pan tilt head. And for this first pass, I had both the lens and the GH5 body with IBIS turned on, so operating in dual mode, and the autofocus turned on. Now I did find that the autofocus would be a bit distracting as it went between objects. It was sort of capturing focus on items from the foreground and then jumping up and capturing items in the background. So it did move back and forth a little bit on the autofocus, and that little bit of movement on the autofocus, it could have an impact on the slider itself in trying to move the overall camera, but really nothing to speak of. A lot of the runs that I did later on, after the first 3 runs, basically, I just switched everything over to manual focus. So in this, I did a total of 9 different runs. Of course, the Olympus 17mm. I did 4 different runs with this Leica 12-60, where I had IBIS basically turned on in dual mode or turned off, and then in combination with the autofocus turned on and the autofocus turned off. 4 different configurations. And just in the event that I'm saying, the grade turns out okay here and it still looks a little bit choppy, I'm going to chalk that up to the encoding of this video and uploading it onto YouTube, because essentially I reviewed every last frame of this footage externally, running the camera directly to a monitor, and basically was not seeing any jitter or judder in any of the scenes where I give it a grade of okay. So this is the time in the program here where I basically turned autofocus off, but I left in-body image stabilization turned on the Leica. What I didn't show here was with in-body image stabilization turned off on the Leica, and also on the body. So I was turned off altogether, and it did result in jitter and unusable footage, particularly at the faster traverse rates on the slide. So show a little bit more information about that later on in the video when I talk about some of my conclusions. So even at that higher speed, top mounted, with the IBIS turned on, seeing some really good results using that lens. So next we switched it up and I put the Sigma 18-35. Now this is mounted on top of the X2 Mini, and this is at a weight that would be not recommended by the manufacturer. It exceeds the weight limitation for mounting the camera on the X2 Mini. Although it did calibrate and said it accepted the calibration, obviously we can see from this footage a lot of vibration and shake, just because that's way too heavy a setup to be putting directly on top of the X2 Mini pan tilt head. So this, of course, is the worst case scenario of heaviest configuration, top mounting on top of the X2 Mini pan tilt head without the L plate, and the in-body image stabilization on the GH5 turned off, and no stabilization on the lens. So I did a full series of these in that configuration, and of course I saw vibration and jitter in pretty much all of these. So what we did next is we're going to take the Sigma 18 to 35, and instead of top mounting it on the X2 head, as you can see here, we're going to side mount it using the L plate, which is used for heavier camera gear because it gets the center of gravity lower. And then also turned on the in-body image stabilization. So again, I did 4 runs with the Sigma with image stabilization turned on and off, and top mounted or L mounted. So I kind of did all different configurations and speeds. And I'm only showing you from that last segment the worst to this segment, which is pretty much the best that I did with the Sigma. Again, mounted on the side and in-body image stabilization turned on. So quite a stark difference from all that shake that was going on in the last configuration to this configuration. And just goes to show that that L plate for heavier gear is well worth the 70 or 80 bucks you got to invest in that additional piece of gear to get the camera down lower, keep that center of gravity lower, and allow the X2 to not be as overloaded. So even in this heaviest configuration on the 1 minute and this 30-minute slide, I basically gave it a passing grade. And then on the very last pass, which is about to come up, which was done in a 15-second pass, there was a little bit of a jitter on the start, as you'll see, and but mostly just a little bit of motion blur, just because the GH5, when it's panned too quickly, you get a little bit of motion camera judder, and I'm using a fairly low bitrate recording to do this. So let's dig into the conclusions a little bit for this. So again, I wanted to try and make a setup where it was an ideal setup for the slider. So no external influences on anything that could introduce shake or jitter into the whole setup. So therefore, we're just evaluating the slider all to itself. So some people might say that this is not a proper setup or realistic of how you would actually use this in the real world, and I would agree with you. But in order to try and evaluate the slider onto itself, I felt that this was important. And if it couldn't pass this test, then of course it's not going to pass any other test that you could throw at it in the real world. So in general terms, the slider did an okay job. So when we look at the results, I've compiled it into a results matrix, and we look at the various modes and the various lenses that were tested, we get the following. I did 9 different camera setups using different lenses and different camera modes. Also, different mounting options were looked at when using the Sigma 18 to 35 lens, top mounted directly on the X2 Mini pan tilt head, and then mounted on the L plate add-on. The Olympus 17mm and the Sigma 18 to 35 are not stabilized lenses, while the Leica 12 to 60 is a stabilized lens, thus allowing for a full gamut of modes from IBIS completely off to camera body stabilization only, up to dual mode stabilization of both camera and lens. When stabilization is turned off, overall results are not ideal by any means, with most or all of the shots showing a little bit of jitter right up to downright shaking of the camera. When stabilization, either body only or dual mode, is turned on, then good results can be achieved, provided the slider is set up properly. At the shortest time spans for the slide, some problems can crop up, particularly at the start and end of the slide, if no speed ramping is used. This is a worst case scenario, as the user can program the start and end of the slide to ramp smoothly, or set up for the slide where footage from the start and end of the slide can be discarded. Again, in general terms, we can deduce that faster slides are going to result in poor performance. So the faster the slide, of course, the harder the motors have to work, and the more chance to introduce a little bit of jitter into the final product. Certainly for heavier cameras, use of the L plate mounted to side mount the camera is obviously going to improve performance. Looking at the Sigma 18 to 35 results with the IBIS turned off and comparing between top mounted to L plate mounted, there's a significant difference in performance. Certainly helps to lower that center of gravity, puts less load on the motors, and you get a much better result using heavier cameras. Add in IBIS on top of that, and then you're just going to get a much better result overall. So for my own purposes, I'm quite happy so far with this compact travel slider setup. As far as recommending it to people, I would say at this point that I have only used this one slider in particular, so I won't attempt to recommend or not recommend this slider compared to any other slider. I would allow the viewer to look at some of my results for the setup and come to your own conclusions on whether this is a good setup for you or not. So my setup is a compact one, and I'm pretty happy using the GH5 on this setup with the 3 lenses that I've shown. Now, I also own the Canon 70-200 IS Mark II f2.8 lens, but being such a big lens with such a long throw, I really don't see the point of trying to mount that on this particular setup. So that'll just about wrap it up for this video, folks. So I plan on doing another video, in which case I'm going to put the slider on an incline, and then I'll do a series of tests with the same 3 lenses, but I'll also test it with a properly weighted counterweight, and then I'll do some runs without the counterweight, just so that we can see the results of that as well, but that'll be in a little bit. If you've got any comments or you'd like to see any particular setups that you'd like to see tested in that, please put it in the comments below, and I'll try and include that in the next video. I hope this has been helpful. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And in the meantime, be good to each other. Later, Gators.